So my name is Kat Townsend. I am currently serving as the Director of Policy at the World Wide Web Foundation. It's an organization founded by Sir Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web, and we work for a free, open, fair, trusted, and affordable web for all around the world. If you will allow me to indulge for just a moment, from the discussions today, there's a lot of really good work happening at the Web Foundation that I want to share with you all, interesting to those who are here today and online. So, few points. Yuping Chen from the UN mentioned earlier today the Global Digital Compact. Nana Nawakanma, our chief web advocate, is leading a lot of that work with engagement in civil society. And so if you are interested in that, please connect with us. She's doing great work around the world. An earlier panel spoke about the digital connectivity divide. You all should know about the Alliance for Affordable Internet. They are doing great work around the world to ensure that there's meaningful access. They primarily work in lower income developing countries. Fantastic team there. Three more, if you are interested in how an organization that is founded by the person who built Web 1 is working on the so-called Web 3 technologies, follow up with us, please. For any working on trusted design, deceptive design, so-called dark patterns. We've got our Tech Policy Design Lab team leading up that work. And what we'll get to later on in this panel, since many of our organizations are working on this, is countering online gender-based violence and harassment. And so we're working with the UN Women for Generation Equality Forum and with a network of feminist tech organizations around the world called Women's Rights Online. So thank you. That is me. And that is my role today, is to be your moderator for this fantastic group. So I'm going to turn it over to them. Panelists Harsha, Bhatlapenumarthy, Dhanaraj, Thakur, and Fred Langford. First question for you all. We've talked a lot about the laws and regulations, and there was discussion earlier about how a lot of these conversations and policy conversations happen in English. So when we have this focus on online safety in the UK, the US, EU, Australia, what is the potential that we have with how those laws affect the globe? And what are we missing? What are the harms we're causing by unduly focusing on discussion of regulation and policy for social media in English?
Happy to start on that one. I think it was touched upon earlier, actually, and I can't remember what her name was, talking about AI, and it was about all different communities do have a say, and I think we're missing that say by just having just a limited number of languages here. And it also means that when we talk about some of the technologies that are being developed, how they're implemented, it's like having a huge gap in knowledge because you haven't got everybody's viewpoint. And you haven't got everybody's impact to draw into it. So it's just something that's missing, really. And so it's going to continue the impact. And we've seen if you don't deal with things at the beginning, it's going to get worse and worse and worse and worse. And it's too late to then try and roll it back. So now is the time to get in. This is why I love these sorts of events, getting everybody together globally again in one place, getting all the different views together.
I could add to what, or build upon what Fred was saying. There are two things come to mind. One is this issue of English language content, which dominates the web and the internet, and the problems around trying to address or moderate content in non-English speaking languages. And there are proposals, ideas to use limited data to automate content moderation in these non-English speaking languages, or what referred to as low resource languages, which could have lots of benefits. But as someone coming from civil society, I'm always want us to consider what are the risks in using these kinds of models and these kinds of approaches. So that's one point. The second thing about regulation or policy development that happens in certain, like here in, like in DC or in Brussels, and the impacts that could have globally, I think one trend is that those developments, those innovations will take the lead. And often what you see is things like the GDPR being viewed almost like a global data policy regulation, right? So countries in Global South look to that as a model. that can be both good or bad, but the problem is what gets, which kinds of ideas get a head start and which kind of ideas take a lead. It often drowns out the narrative and discussion from other policy innovations coming from other places in the global south and elsewhere. So that to me is problematic.
I agree with what Fred said, and also I know we discussed in one of the previous panels. I think it's about making sure that we have all kinds of backgrounds represented, both when we're developing automation classifiers or when we're developing policies. Because I think when that representation happens on front lines, we will see that in the outcomes eventually that we will have.
Very strong point. You need to have that diversity actually in the people who are creating the work. Picking up on some points on content moderation. For those of us who are gathered in person, we're in New York State, where this week, 10 people were murdered by a white supremacist carrying a illegal semi-automatic assault rifle. And the video of this was put up on social media and stayed up for 10 hours. And the perpetrator, as we know, or as we've learned, was inspired by other videos that were shared on social media. And so what I'd like us to consider or try to reconcile is we've heard today about how difficult it is to have transparency, and that if we share data, that it can be used by bad actors to do even more harms. And so how do we reconcile with what's actually happening on the platforms today with the real difficulties of those who work in these organizations that are trying to navigate the tasks of finding and taking harmful content online, and of the regulators following up with them. So.
Okay, so can you hear me? It's a difficult question, so I was trying to take a moment to think. One I want to call out is when usually such scenarios happen, or when we have these questions, right? Why did we not get to a certain content in 10 seconds or 2 seconds, or why did we do XYZ? I think the biggest challenge, and it's not a new challenge, I'm sure a lot of you have experienced this, happens to be scale. Because we have generally platforms of millions of content to address, get to, and it's about getting to the right content at the right time. And there's a lot that happens behind the scenes in getting to that. But I think what we need is to make incremental improvements to eventually bring this 10 hours down to, I don't know, 2 hours or whatever that is. So that's one point on how do we address quickly. And simultaneously, how do we make sure we have enough guardrails that when this happens, our response time is a lot more agile and a lot more comprehensive. And then the reason I say incremental improvements is because I think when I started working in trust and safety, I was almost 8 to 9 years ago. I used to do a lot of content moderation. I don't think at the time we had the scale of automation we have today. So we've come a long way where, most of the platforms address content. I think more than 90% of the content gets taken down through automation. So we've come a long way when we consider that. So I think our focus should continue to be in that direction.
It's interesting you should ask that. I mean, the online safety bill that Ofcom will be regulating is very much around systems and processes and risk. But the challenges are broader than just individual platforms, and how that sharing can take place. Internet is global, to coin a colleague's friend, so we should be thinking globally as well. And that's clear for those of us who have been working online for so long, but it's not necessarily clear for a lot of policymakers. certainly in certain institutions. And so it's how, and I absolutely agree, it's how it can be improved. How can things be improved? Really, we're trying to work out, okay, what happened? Were there ways it could be improved? It's not always as straightforward as many people think. I mean, for moderators, I ran a team of analysts for nearly 20 years looking at serious content. And so I'm used to these sort of patterns of reoccurring again. But it's something that's always changing as well. It's a bit, to coin the usual phrase, it's an arms race. And things do change. The technology changes. The way that different platforms connect to each other changes, and the way people innovate by using those for nefarious reasons as well. Let's face it, this person was not trying to do this out of altruistic reasons. Well, they may have thought they were doing that themselves, but they were delusional. And so they were trying to use the platforms and had cohorts as well. So I do have sympathy for platforms here when they're trying to do their best and people are gaming them. We were talking about Algo Speak, and there are networks of people out there who are trying to work out ways of getting around the checks and balances all the time. They're sharing them with colleagues, and then they're working in sorts of small groups as well. So with those sorts of things in mind, you have to be realistic, and we're realistic as a regulator. So we're already thinking of systems and processes, but if there's no will to keep pushing that and get better, that's where we can step in and push a little bit more. But really, the view that Ofcom have is to try and help people to innovate, to try and identify where those gaps are, and trying to say, come on, guys, you work together, and if you don't do something, we will. And that's sort of the approach that we're thinking about.
Yeah, I think the arms race description is accurate. I think there's lots of improvements that have been made in terms of automation. And at the same time, there are constantly bad actors trying to game the system. I think what I'd add is that what's important to understand, especially for policymakers and others, are the limitations and risks that come with automated content moderation systems, and for developers to communicate that to the public at large. What we would not want to see is a law, for example, mandating some kind of filtering or automated content moderation on specific kinds of content, because none of these things are completely foolproof. I think we all understand that, but communicating that and making sure that the narrative isn't that, oh, an AI model is going to capture all this content, right? There are risks and limitations in it, and so communicating and making sure people understand is important. I think something else, just step back to the example you mentioned, the horrific tragedy, is that part of this is stemming from society at large. Not everything, there's not a technical solution for everything, right? There are bigger issues happening here, and I think recognizing that would also mean that there are limitations to what kinds of technical solutions can be put forward. Like, can a social media company solve this problem by itself? No. So there's a wider set of issues here, and what might be more useful is for social media companies or other actors, policymakers, regulators, to be engaged with those other actors that have been working on these for decades and years, right? I mean, like social workers and other kinds of community groups and groups that represent underrepresented or minorities and so on.
Yeah, I very much appreciate the emphasis on multidisciplinary, and that it's not the idea that it is up to a single sector or a single organization or team to fix the ills of society. And yeah, how do we work together and try to have a collaboration as wherever possible? So one question then is, if we need that kind of dynamic and that diversity, who is missing from these conversations? And what we've seen, and what a lot of your research has been working on, is people who get harassed and targeted online are women, minoritized genders, minoritized groups in general. And the problem when this happens is that not only do harms online affect the offline world, as Julie so reminded us and shared with us, it also means that you lose someone's creativity and you lose their voice. So we're working towards a society where we don't have a diversity of voices represented online. People who are running for office get targeted. They pull their accounts offline and then they drop out of races. So we don't have their leadership in building these systems that we'd want to continue to do this work in a collaborative way. So I wonder if you can share some of the work that you all have been doing in how we have and how we're building social media platforms or just the web in general in a way that embraces everyone, works together so that gender-based violence, harassment, and targeting is curbed, and we're building the web we want.
Sure, I can start. Yes, so this is a serious problem as you described it. There is lots of evidence and research point to the severe kinds of mental, physical, community harms, intergenerational harms that come from harassment, which then deprives many communities. Globally, women, as the research from the Web Foundation has shown, are less likely to be using the internet. But there's also other research. I can think of the Amnesty report that showed Black women, for example, are more likely to be harassed on Twitter than any other kind of group, or white women, for example. So there are disproportionate impacts even within this broad era of harassment on particular communities. I think it's important to recognize those kinds of disproportionate impacts in the first place. And there are areas in which progress has been made in terms of trying to identify harassment, address harassment, reporting mechanisms, and so on. What I would want to maybe just highlight, though, is maybe at the higher level is the kind of reflexivity that's required among those groups that are often outside. I'm talking specifically of cisgendered straight men who are often not, are less likely to be suffered from these kinds of abuse, and are often in parallel part or have the power in many of these companies or within government or in society to make decisions around the impacts or the directions that solutions for these kinds of abuse. So it really comes down to, I think in part of the issue here is that kind of reflection among men such as myself to recognize the severity of this problem and act upon it, and not just rely on others, those that are being harmed, to take the lead in addressing that. It's a kind of a more high level point that I just want to raise.
Sure, I'm not necessarily building the web, I suppose, as a regulator, but I like to think that we're sort of the moral conscience of people who are building the web. And I would add in that list of people that are missing are children. They continually get forgotten, and I'm always going to stand up for them and their voice. And I would say as a regulator, these sorts of considerations are built into things like risk assessments. Consider these sorts of minorities that aren't being well represented as part of the risk assessments that are going to come in as part of our regulation. So I think from that perspective, it's very much pushing to make sure that those voices are heard from a regulatory perspective.
A brief follow-up about that. When you had the focus on children online, and so you have to disaggregate the data between who is a child online and who's an adult, then you're actually segmentizing a population so that it can be targeted. How do you reconcile that as a regulator?
I wouldn't say targeted. I mean, that sounds like quite sinister. I would say supported instead. And I think it's key that people do know that who's on their platform and how to support them. Because if you don't know who's on the platform, how can you support them? And so I would push back a little bit on that point and actually say, no, it's about supporting, not targeting.
Yeah, Harsha?
I think thinking about how to make it more inclusive for everyone, including women, like you said. One, it kind of ties back to my point to how do we have everyone at the table when we're solving these problems. That's one point. But second, also, I think goes back to some of the conversations we had around transparency. is how can we empower all sections of the society with understanding on what is happening behind the screens when we're building the processes we build and making the decisions we make. And I know a lot of the work is ongoing, but I think continuing that could be helpful, and especially adding to what Dhanaraj said.
I'll just highlight some of the discussions from the earlier panels. It is about the pipeline, and if you're educating a generation of technologists who are coming to work in these spaces, in these sectors that do have a diverse perspective, and that's the kind of leadership that we need. So it is, as Dr. Cummings said, it's the future, and the future is bright. So switching on that road, I'd love to know what is making you all hopeful? What are you excited about, whether it's your work or others? Harsha, I know that you've been doing a lot on the TPSA.
TSPA.
Sorry. Yeah, acronym switch. But that curriculum and the development of that is very exciting. So maybe you can speak a bit more about that community and in a global way of the work that you're bringing together.
Sure. So TSPA, for those of you who don't know, it's called Trust and Safety Professional Association. It's a member-based association, which is focusing on advancing the practice of trust and safety. I know I see a few of advisors here in the room, so I'm very excited. But I've been volunteering with that company for about 1.5 years now. And one thing I'm very excited about, tying back to our discussions around transparency, is that we're developing a curriculum which outlines all the practices of trust and safety, the activities that go behind the processes and the decisions that we make. And I personally think that it's a great way of creating very macro level transparency. You're taking, because current transparency reports, you see data, you see numbers, you see what happened in the last quarter. But things like the curriculum, they give you real insight into what happens, what is the thought process, why we make the decisions we make. That's something I'm very excited about. And I know especially today, a lot of the discussions were focused on transparency. So I'm making a very shameless but proud plug there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think there is progress that's being made in transparency in other ways too, just to build on this. So one thing that's been very crucial with regard to understand or even addressing all the issues there is independent researcher access to data from social media companies. This applies not just to academics, but those of us who are researching civil society, regulators, I'm sure, and others. So here, I think there's momentum now, and in fact, legislation in DC and in Brussels, as you all know, that to address a specific topic. So there, if we're looking for like a point of hope here, I think there's a lot of momentum around this. There's a lot of details that need to be worked out, like who exactly is a researcher, what are the means of access, what kinds of data should be shared in a privacy preserving way, and others. But there is, I think, political will on both sides of the Atlantic, at least on this point, to make some progress. And there's a lot of work that we, in fact, at the Center for Democracy and Technology are engaged in, along with others on this point.
Yes, well, I think it was Donna who said it earlier, actually. I think people working in trust and safety felt like they've been in the basement for too long. And what's optimistic is they're coming out now, like zombie invasion. We're coming out. People are saying that there's challenges out there. We want to work together. We want to deal with it, and that's what's making me optimistic now. Is that people are emerging, that these things are coming out now. And you said yourself, you've been working in this for a long time, and I know that these sorts of topics have been discussed for some time, and they're coming to the fore, and we've actually got to tackle them. And that's what's keeping me excited is having a debate, is having a lively debate. How are we going to tackle these together, and what is the best path?
Thank you. So as we're designing that best path, and we have the legislation that can perhaps come into place, we have some of the guidance in the boards. You're focused on the implementation and how do you operationalize? So how do you train this next generation? What do you see are the potentials and current disconnect with how we're actually operationalizing a lot of the good work that we're trying to put into place, or that you all are trying to put into place.
I'll start on that one. Yeah, there's lots of challenges of operationalizing, and I come from generally an operational background as well. And definitions, somebody said it earlier, is key. And understanding that there are a lot of nuances and there are things that aren't going to be possible. As much as people think they are possible, they might not actually be possible. And sometimes you don't even realize that to start with. And as a regulator, I think that's why our regulation was potentially going to work very well, because it looks at the systems and processes. We would engage. We want to know what's happening. We'd be asking the questions. They wouldn't be easy questions. I'm not going to claim we're going to sit there and just be nice to everybody, but we're going to ask those questions and be realistic. I mean, we talk about, if we talk about computer vision and some of the challenges when you're trying to identify between, a colleague of mine keeps showing me a picture of a bagel and a dog curled up. And every time he says, there's no way I can't find any algorithm that can spot the difference unless I get an absolute match and use, a complete crypto hashing algorithm instead, which is obviously not going to work particularly well on a lot of these platforms. So there are many, many technical challenges. And I think I said at the beginning, as technology develops and as people work out ways to try and gamify them, algo speak, someone was talking about earlier, absolutely agree. It's a bit of an arms race again. I keep saying it's developing and changing and working on what's happening.
Right, just to clarify, is your question around operationalizing regulation or operationalizing policies?
I'm pretty focused on operationalizing policies, but yes, if you're up, I think the question is when you have something that you're aspiring to do, actually changing people's work plan, changing how they operate day to day, and ensuring that those who are actually holding them accountable are empowered to do so and can iterate on this work. Do you see that's being built into, the kinds of changes that you're trying to develop?
Broadly, yes. I think whenever I personally have worked in the past to operationalize something new, where it has great influence on a certain team's work, or if it directly impacts content moderators, I think I can especially talk from my experience of operationalizing policies, where from the moment from the step between, actually, let me take a step back. So if I think about policies, right, I think about it in 4 steps. You see a problem, you create a policy. I know it's not as simple as 2 steps, but if I have to simplify it, and when you attempt to enforce policy, and then you monitor and control metrics and see how the policy is performing, right? And between the step of creating policy and operationalizing it, I think that's where your question goes back, is how it impacts content moderators or teams working on it. I think we have a pretty streamlined way of doing that now, generally in the industry, because we have a set of standard procedures and practices. But one of the topics that I personally think a lot about is it relies a lot on setting the content moderator up for success. A lot of it depends on that. But yes, I think we're in a much better position, definitely.
Well, I would just maybe add that I think there's a lot of work being done in terms of like what I'd call policy translation. So taking research, evidence, translating and making it accessible to policymakers and regulators to inform this operationalization phase. So like the definitions, does that particular computer vision algorithm work, or what are the risks? I think that, however, we still need a lot of improvement there. We still see legislative proposals making huge, sometimes way out assumptions about the efficacy of AR algorithms or what they can or cannot do. And so we still need that bridge, that connection between like actual empirical research to inform this. That's something we work on, but I think there's still more to be done there.
Okay, and then thank you. A lot of work, and it's going to require all of us to work together on it. So the last that I'll ask you all is just to your perspective on what's the role for those who aren't in this room and actively engaged in this work every day. And how do we empower, or how do we work more broadly so that everybody who would want to be involved or wants to be able to contribute, like how do you have a system where those who are not hyper-connected are able to help and support and shape the kind of online world, the kind of social media platforms that really facilitate us to grow and to thrive as a people. Like just maybe one or two thoughts.
That's a tricky one. I mean, it's a difficult one for me to answer because we're in the middle of that phase at the moment. So there is a debate going on about how, you know, what that regulation is going to be like, and we've got democratic process and obviously elected officials talking about that, and they're making the decision. And as a regulator, we implement that decision. And so I'd probably leave it at that from a regulator's perspective, to be quite honest with you, because we do have, you know, as a regulator, we're always listening, we're always trying to convene stakeholder engagement and talk to different people to understand for how we can interpret it. But at the moment, talking particularly around online safety for us, for me as a regulator, we're in a bit of a sort of the grey zone at the moment. So it's very much about waiting to see what that final decision comes out of the actual parliamentary process before we can then try and work out how best to get those voices in for whatever ends up coming out the other end.
Yeah, I think this is an ongoing problem, right? Because we want that inclusivity. And we have different tactics and methods, co-design, you know, working with different groups, the stakeholders kind of form the stakeholder engagement. I think what's always going to be needed is some kind of intentionality to make sure that we are going to go out of our way to get different people, to get the voices in the room and the missing voices in the room. That falls back a lot on, you know, who's at the table in the first place, because their perception of what's missing is going to be different. And so we come back to this problem that several panels have discussed earlier about diversity, inclusion, and so on. So that's part of this, like that the whole diversity and inclusion problem is part of, is almost like a first step before we get to envisioning who are the missing voices and getting them into the room. So the problems kind of stack up, but if we kind of recognize that connection, I think it's helpful.
Okay, I'm not sure if I should, okay. I think it's also to some extent a two-way street. That is, I think as an industry or as a trust and safety community, or, you know, the not-profits that we work with, I think we should do the outreach and make sure that, you know, like to the points that I previously made, making sure we have the right kind of voices on the table. But I also think, especially folks who are already partially involved in this space, to exploring opportunities to participate more in these conversations. And even, you know, coming to forums like these and sharing your thoughts. And I know, you know, we've been talking for the last few minutes. Some of you may agree with what we said. Some of you may have challenging viewpoints. But I think having more conversations like these and being open to this is also a good first step.
So diversity of opinions and thoughts, perspectives, who gets to be part of the conversation, who gets to make the decision. And I will just plug that the web is not complete and it is not being developed by a few. We're all building it continuously. And we all get to have a say in what we want it to look like. So thank you all, and please help me thank the panelists.